Morning, Lloyd, and welcome back to the studio.
Hi, Amanda. How you going?
Oh, very well. Were you up early this morning?
I was always up early, but my kids are always out of bed. I think my youngest one got up because his music stopped playing, so I had to go and fix that, but all good.
Oh, very good. Well, look, today's podcast, I think we should be looking at investment strategy and market trends. There's a lot going on in 2025. I think we can add some value to our listeners. Let's get right into it.
Absolutely.
So, building a positive portfolio in 2025, is it still possible?
Yeah, well, let's break that down a bit because I think when people think about positively geared, they really focus on each property being positively geared. What I am trying to sort of explain to people a bit these days is the need for, to have a positively geared portfolio over time, not necessarily every single property needing to be positively geared. Because I think that's sometimes people's focus because they're sort of worried about cash flow and things like that. And in the current markets with the high interest rates, it's very hard to get positively geared properties. While it is possible, you may not be buying in the best locations. You might be buying a subprime property and things like that. As we've spoken about before, you don't want to be out in the sticks buying in a mining town or something like that. So we do need to balance growth and yield because I think when people are only looking for yield, and they are sacrificing growth just to have something that's going to give that really high cash flow, then, if they look at where they'll be in the next 5 or 10 years and that property hasn't had much growth of any, they're not going to be any further advanced. So I think it's really important to get an asset that does grow in value, even if the yield is a little bit lower, with the end goal being to have a positively geared portfolio by paying down debt, by maybe getting rid of some of those early properties, paying down that debt, paying off some of your other debt, so you end up being positively geared over time. And that's like why we've always talked about having a goal in mind, having that why are you investing, and what is the time frame? What is your time frame for retiring? When do you want to quit? If it's quit your job or pay for your kids' school fees, put a time frame on that. Is that 10 years, for example? Then we can work towards that rather than just saying I have to buy a property now and it's got to be completely positively geared, because that's where people are going to struggle a little bit. So it's about managing expectations a little bit.
So are we moving into more maybe of a neutral market with returns on property maybe?
Yeah, so again, that really depends on where you're buying, but it is possible to get properties that are much closer to neutral, obviously, than positively geared. But again, you'll be buying in sort of regional markets to get that, as opposed to capital city markets where they'll be a little bit negatively geared. So we just need to look at what's right for your strategy and everything, because for me, when I was building up my portfolio, and even I wrote a book called Positively Geared. That wasn't about being positively geared on every property. It's about having that portfolio positively geared, because even now with my properties, I've got a positively geared portfolio. Some of the properties are paid off, but some of them are still negative cash flow. But overall, it's positively geared. And that's always been a balance of buying in regional markets where I do have that neutral to positively geared. And if you do buy properties that are neutral or slightly negative, they can become positively geared quite quickly in those markets. But then, balancing them in, with capital city markets that get that strong growth, is important as well. But there's other strategies as well that we can talk about. Things like value add strategies to increase that equity, which also increases the cash flow. Buying dual income properties, because if you've got something with 2 lots of income coming in, or even a triplex with 3 lots of income, then you're actually getting that cash flow. So that is a strategy to potentially get that positively geared property straight away. But then you need to still look at the quality of the asset that you're buying.
There is possibility out there still, because I think with interest rates being what they are, they've obviously crept up a huge amount over the last 2.5 years. So with value adding to the property they may be looking at, so some people out there might actually have an investment property already that's quite heavily negative geared. What should they be looking at to try and boost that return? Because I'd say they're struggling out there with that property at the moment.
Yeah, so I think the first thing people should be looking at is cosmetic renovations. Not necessarily doing anything structural, because once you start doing extensions, you often need to get council approvals, but that can be also more expensive because you've you're putting in maybe putting in extra room, or you're putting a extension out the back and things like that. If you're doing cosmetic stuff around paintwork, floor coverings, window coverings, maybe putting a new splashback in the kitchen, new tiles in the bathroom, a bit of landscaping on the outside, then that can be quite measurable in terms of costs. I always like to look at it as spending $1 and getting $3 back. So that's why I kind of measure it. Obviously, we've previously had Sri Barber on our podcast, and we went into length about her. She's an absolute renovation expert. With me, I like to sort of look at trying to limit the amount that we'd spend on a property. So usually sort of around 5 to 7% of probably the property's value, or maybe of what you bought the property for, depending on when you bought it. The most important thing, as Cherie pointed out, is what the return on the property will be after you've done that renovation. So you need to make sure that you're doing the sort of work that's right for that demographic, and that you're not overcapitalising, because you don't want to just go and throw in a new kitchen, a new bathroom, and spend 50 grand on a property for it not to actually return you that much. So you just need to look at the things that are actually going to increase that return, and often just sprucing it up with a coat of paint. That if you do it yourself, you just got to pay for paint, a few $100s, or even if you get a painter and you pay them 5 or 6 grand, that can be quite cost effective and really increase the rental return for you.
And are you seeing customers come to you with these sort of issues, say we need to boost our rental yield on the properties we have? Is that seen to be a trend?
That is a little bit of a trend, and definitely we are seeing that with the clients that we work with. Because we work with them for the long term, we're often catching up with them probably sort of every 6 months. If they're not actively buying a purchase, we're sort of keeping in contact with them and stuff, and we're often having that conversation. How's your cash flow going? We've got a property portfolio tracker that our clients use, so they can understand their complete cash flow situation with each property and with their overall portfolio. So we analyse that, see what the situation is, how they're managing, and what we can do to help with that. But the one thing that I think is really important for people to understand is that the interest rates aren't going to be high forever. They're probably going to come down this year. And we need to make sure that, we're not just focused on high interest rates and how can we get positively geared property now, because, if we hang in there, the interest rates will come down, and, the yields will get better and get more comfortable for you as well.
Do you think then they should maybe look at refinancing too? Because I know the banks are all starting to move their fixed rates at the moment down, and the Reserve Bank hasn't done anything yet. Do you think they should be looking at their finances and what rate they're actually paying?
Yeah, that's always a conversation people should be having. So have a chat to your bank, have a chat to your mortgage broker. And even if you can just move your rate by, 25 basis points, which is basically 0.25%, that's even something. And if you've got a few properties, you can do that across your portfolio. That can really help. But have that conversation. And if that doesn't work, see if you can take your business to another bank. I'd also recommend people to look at not just the main banks, but look at some of the second-tier lenders, because they're all backed by the major banks as well. Now, sometimes the non-bank lenders can have higher interest rates, but sometimes they can be more attractive in terms of interest rates than the big four. That obviously comes down to the buyer themselves, their own serviceability, their own financial capacity and everything. But it's definitely worth having that conversation.
What other strategies can people utilise to get themselves in the property market?
Well, in terms of strategies with property, like we talked about renovations, I think it's really important to not just think about buying and holding property. For some people, that works, but depending on where you buy, you could be buying into a slower growth market. Particularly if you've got a lower budget, you might be buying regional, where the growth will come, but it might be a little bit slower. So as well as the idea of renovation, you could look at potentially buying a block that has the ability to have a granny flat on it. Putting a granny flat there isn't necessarily going to add massive amounts of equity to your portfolio or to that property, but that will certainly help with the cash flow on the property, because it'll turn into a dual income. It'll really increase that yield. That is a way of turning property into being positively geared, as long as you can get the funding to build a granny flat. But building a granny flat is much more affordable than building a full house or building something bigger. So that's definitely something. And just looking out for a block that's big enough to do that, that fits the council requirements. So just checking with council or with town planners, and you generally need to have an access handle that's suitable within those council requirements. An access handle is basically the distance between the existing houses there and the boundary fence, so that you can create a driveway to get up to the granny flat at the back. So that's one strategy. Another strategy would be to find a property that you can potentially subdivide. Another value add strategy. So this is where you might get a larger block. That varies between council areas. So for some areas, you can subdivide land that's on something as small as 700 or 800 squares. For other areas, it might be 1,000 or even more than 1,000 squares to be able to subdivide. So again, it comes down to budget and your actual reason, again, comes down to the why and everything like that, the reason for buying it and things like that. But getting something that large and subdividing, you can create equity there. Now, with that additional block that you've just created, you could potentially sell that as vacant land and create some profit that way. That's a strategy that used to work quite well. Doesn't work as well at the moment because people are a little bit concerned about the rising cost of construction and the supply chain delays that we saw during COVID. Although most of those are behind us, people are still a bit worried about that. So therefore, selling vacant land is a little bit harder to do. So I'd be a bit careful about that strategy, but it is a strategy. But if you were going to do that and you had a little bit more money to spend, I'd probably recommend subdividing and then maybe building a house out the back, because it'd be easier to sell a house that you built than sell vacant land. Or you could actually build a house and keep it and rent it out. If the block's big enough, you could actually build a duplex there.
Now, I know in your book you talk about this, and you may not have the money to subdivide and build the land, but you sort of had a strategy around that as well to bring in a second person to help you build it. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that as well?
So a few people that I've worked with have done that. So you bring in it's called a joint venture partner, a JV partner. So essentially, you got yourself and someone else. So you could be the money partner and someone else can be the serviceability partner. So you might have money to do something, but you're maxed out with the bank. Banks won't lend you any more money. So someone else who can actually get a loan from the bank might come and be able to get the serviceability. Then you can put the funds down to be able to do it, which is generally the deposit. So it might be a 10 or a 20% deposit that you could come up with. But together, you could do something like that, and you could certainly be able to afford to do something that you may not be able to do just by yourself. The numbers obviously need to work out because it needs to work out for both of you. There are risks involved with that. What happens if it doesn't work out? What happens if you don't make the profit that you want? And what if things go belly up? There's a few things that can happen with construction projects and stuff. So it's really important, I think, to get a JV contract drawn up by a solicitor and understand exactly what you're getting yourself in for and what are the risks of it. An example of that was a few years ago when one of my clients went into a JV together, but they didn't have a JV contract drawn up. They built a duplex. I managed the duplex construction for them, and that all went well. But on completion, and the duplexes were actually identical, but it was on a corner block. So one was facing one way at a particular street, the other was on the other street. So great duplex on a good corner street, a corner block. However, when they got the valuations done, the valuations came in at different prices, and of course the clients weren't happy because one was higher valuation than the other, and of course the person that had the lower valuation wasn't happy, and they wanted to try to sort it out and everything. But in the first place, they didn't want to have a JV contract put in place because they thought they were friends and everything would be fine, and sort of almost broke their friendship up and everything.
How did they resolve that at the end?
Well, in the end, they sold the properties, which was originally their plan, but one sold for a little bit more than the other. It was only about 20 grand, but one wasn't happy.
Well, that's interesting. Why did it sell for an extra 20 grand, do you think, at the end?
That's just the market, isn't it? There's no particular reason. It might have been just the street appeal of that market, but as you know from an agent's point of view, they were both put on the market at the same time. One sold a week before the other one. The one that sold more expensive, the 20 grand more, sold a week later. So one sold at a certain price. Can't remember the exact figure off the top of my head now. And the agents might have pushed the price up and said, well, we sold this one at this price and this is a better property because it's facing that way.
Might have more competition because there's only one left.
You know how agents talk and all that kind of stuff. So that's how that worked. But just an example that, people should have a JV in place if they're going to do something like that.
So it worked out for them in the end, though. They made money out of that development?
They both made money, absolutely. But the thing about that is, the key about that is if you're going to do a JV, have a contract drawn up so you know exactly what the risks are, and maybe it might be better to share the profits. If you're going to sell, then just pull the profits together and you take 50-50 each, rather than just saying, I'll take that unit, and then one sells more than the other, and then you get unhappy about it.
And that should just put out in their JV so they don't have these arguments
exactly
at the end.
Yep.
And probably another one that probably investors out there are toiling with, they may have had a property for a long time. Should they ever think about selling it? If they've bought it for rental yield, should they ever think about selling it?
Well, that's a really interesting question. And there's a lot of people who will say that you should never sell a property, you should keep a property forever because it's going to keep compounding and getting growth. So there's a few reasons that you might want to sell a property. One is if the property hasn't done that well. So I've probably sold one or two properties over the years that I probably held through at least one, maybe two full property cycles. Now, a property cycle for me could be anywhere between 7 to 13 years, getting top of the growth and then the bottom of the cycle and things. So holding for a considerable time, you shouldn't be selling a property after a couple of years and expecting to make massive growth on it, because it is more of a long-term game. It's different if you're doing a development. If you build a development and you want to sell it, make profit, that's kind of a bit different.
That's your initial plan.
Yeah, but with an investment, you need to keep it for a bit longer. Selling it if it hasn't done so well, It may be investment that you should have done well. You did all the research and it's in a good market, but then everybody else bought in that market. The market got saturated, so it didn't get as much growth as you wanted. But the other reason that could be worth selling, again, this is something I've done, is if you've got a plan in place that you need to buy something, say your dream home. My wife and I bought our dream home down in the Shire in Sydney, and I sold a couple of properties to help fund that. So, and that was always going to be the plan, to buy that home, and I need to sell a couple of properties to sort of help raise the deposit for that and everything like that. So although selling properties, you've got to pay a bit of capital gains tax and things like that, I had a reason for doing that because it was helping me achieve what was one of my dreams. So that's an important thing, but you need to sort of have a real reason for doing it. Don't just sell because you think you've made some money and, I'd like to bank some money, because at the end of the day, there's nothing like compounding growth in property. So if you're going to sell and then just decide you're going to reinvest it needs to be a strategy behind that. Otherwise, there's no real reason.
Because there's quite a few expenses too when you go to sell a property if you're going to reinvest.
There is, absolutely, because you've got your capital gains tax, but then you've also got the costs of the real estate agent that you're using to sell the property. The stamp duty that you originally paid, that's the cost of buying the property, but you don't get that back when you sell. You might have to pay land tax on the property, and there's all sorts of things like that as well. The other reason that you might sell properties is to just pay down some other debt. Now, again, this is something that I've done a little bit of, and it's not necessarily for everybody unless you're in that sort of situation. So again, it's where you need to take a bit of advice from the right people and things. But for me, I'm in the process of paying down my portfolio, but I'm also still investing. But I've got a number of properties that are fully paid off. But part of paying them off was by selling some properties that had had substantial growth over the years. Now, they were properties that achieved organic capital growth, and some might have been ones that I'd added value to through renovation.
How did you pick which ones you wanted to sell?
Usually ones that had made substantial growth, but I felt they weren't going to go any further because, I felt they'd probably reached the top and it'd be a while before they got any more growth. For example, one was a property that I held for about 23 years, probably the first property I bought. It had substantial growth in the early stages, but since COVID, it had almost no growth. But it hadn't gone backwards either. It just remained pretty steady. So I thought, this has probably reached as far as it's going to get. It's been a great property for me. It made me some good growth over the years. I'd refinanced the property a few times over the years to help leverage into other properties. So it actually helped me build my portfolio in the early stages, and then it helped me pay down some other debt, later on as well. So again, you just need to have a strategy in place, understand why you're doing it, because again, there's expenses involved with selling a property, and you need to make a substantial gain on the property because there are expenses. So it's not just something you can say, okay, well, I've made $500,000 equity, so I can just sell my property, because you're going to lose a lot of that in expenses and tax and things. Even if you sell it and you've got to pay all those expenses, if then you can put a chunk of equity onto other debt and you pay off some other debt and you own properties unencumbered, then that's how you achieve fully passive income, and you're completely positively geared when you've got no debt on properties. And that's kind of the ultimate goal, because people talk about being positively geared, but even when you buy a positively geared property at, say, 6.5-7% yield as an example, you're only going to be a little bit positively geared because you've still got debt, depending on how you leverage debt, 10, 20% deposit. However, if you pay down that debt, then that's when you become truly positively geared. And I guess another example of that is, like, when I buy in capital cities now, my properties are positively geared straight away because I put down a much larger deposit and borrow less.
So on a percentage term, and you're in a capital city, what sort of deposit do you need to put down to either get to a neutral position or positively geared?
Obviously, it depends on the property, the price point and the yield that it's paying. I generally put down about a 50% deposit now, but that's not something that everybody is able to do to start with.
Absolutely.
And I'm by no means saying that that's something that people are able to do now, but I'm just saying over time, that's what we want to aim for. Now, I've been investing for about 23 years or something now, so I'm in a position now where I can do things like that. So when I buy a blue chip property, I do put a chunk of deposit on there. So I don't leverage it really, really high. I don't go in and just borrow 90% and just put down 10%. And leverage it really highly, because I'm at a stage where I want to have that cash flow. I'm buying good growth assets, but I also want to have that cash flow, straight away. So that's kind of my strategy with that.
And that probably leads me to my next question as well. For people out there, especially in today's market, how do they protect themselves to the downturn in today's markets?
The very important thing, and probably the most important thing, is buying where there's demand for people to live. So it's actually the location of the property is probably the most important thing. So it comes back to not buying that mining town again, essentially. And even if you are buying in a regional town, buy in the right location, buy close to amenities. Buy in that quiet street, buy close to the hospital, buy in those school catchment zones, buy where there's a high percentage of owner-occupiers, about 75-80% owner-occupiers, for example, because that's where the demand for a property will be. Look at the trends. Look at the infrastructure that's going into a market. Look at the population growth, the jobs growth. Are people moving to that suburb or to that town? Because you want to make sure there's demand for property moving forward. You don't want to be buying where there's an oversupply of property. I'd recommend people don't buy new house and land packages on the fringes or buy off the plan because that's probably what I'd call lazy investments. I'd recommend that people really look at good quality investments in infill areas.
Because look, that is a big topic. I say a lot of people get drawn into that house and land package. They get a brand new home, new street, and it looks fabulous. What do you see as the problems in buying in that?
I love house and land packages. I'd buy a house and land package about 20 years after it was built. Because keep in mind, all properties were new properties and house and land packages of some sort at some stage. So all suburbs are new. The problem with house and land packages is that they're usually in new areas that are not established. So there's going to be lots of them going up at the same time. No real scarcity, because scarcity is really important with investment. And a lot of the time these properties look fairly similar as well. So they'll be coming to the market at the same time. That'll won't be good for growth, won't be good for getting tenants quickly. So the vacancy rates in that particular suburb will probably be a bit higher and stuff as well.
Is that probably because everyone's looking to rent their home out at the same time because they're all finished fairly close to each other?
Yeah, that's right, absolutely. But I just think the actual location of those areas, because they're built where there's new land supply, so it's going to be on the outer suburbs of cities, or it's going to be, even in regional markets, it's going to be on those outer suburbs. And it's even worse in regional markets because there's so much land surrounding them, and then you've got a house and land package on that outer suburb. So that is a way to mitigate your risk, is by not buying that type of property essentially. But like I said, it's just about buying a property that's in demand, that where people will want to live, where there's infrastructure, where there's there's good transport links, all that kind of stuff. And I think it's important also to look at your strategy, how your finance is set up. If you need good cash flow, get a good cash flow property. Don't try to stretch yourself to buy that blue chip property if the cash flow is not good enough for you. Of course, part of your strategy can be to get into that blue chip property later on. Don't be scared to go a bit under your budget and maybe go out to an outer suburb or something a bit more regional and get a higher yield, as long as there's a good, strong market, because that might be more comfortable for you. So, the bank might say you can borrow 900K. You don't have to do that. You could buy a good property for 600K. So buy within your limits. I've always been quite conservative and risk adverse myself. Even back in the day when I was buying 4 or 5 properties a year, I was still quite measured and quite a bit scared, but risk adverse when I was doing it. So everything was I was trying to sort of sort things out and making sure that I wasn't putting myself in danger or putting my family in danger when I was doing it.
Yeah, the other one that seems to come up a lot now too is off the plan buying for units. Now I know it's something you don't recommend. Do you want to probably explain that as well?
Well, the problem with off the plan is that you're basically buying something for the future that doesn't exist now. That's often spoken about by people who are selling them because, if you buy into the right market, then in 3 years' time when it settles, then that market should be going up in value. So you're actually going to be buying for less than what the market will be worth and what that property will be worth when it settles in 3 years' time when it's supposed to finish. However, it very rarely works that way because, again, there's no scarcity. You're buying something that's probably going to be one of many units. You might buy in a building where there's 100 or 200 units, and they're all going to come onto the market at exactly the same time. That's actually even worse than a house and land package because you own very little land value there. At least with a house and land package, there's some land content.
Yeah.
There's very little land content in an apartment. So that's an issue. But there's other risks with that. They very rarely finish when the developer says they're going to finish, so they often go late. My experience with people that have done that is that they've had their deposit tied up and often their borrowing power tied up in that, and they come to me and say, I really want to get into a property, but my broker says I can't do anything until my apartment settles, which I bought off the plan last year, but it doesn't settle for 3 years. Often they go past the sunset clause, which means that the contract expires, and sometimes they don't. It doesn't happen at all. So there is a bit of risk involved.
What about if they lost their job and they've bought off the plan?
Well, that's another risk, isn't it? Because you can't get finance for an off the plan apartment until
close to completion.
Until the titles are registered, and then sort of 21 days from you're going to settle. That's when you're notified, and then you get your finance in order. So a lot can change. So there's between when you sign the
Well,
contract
3
for
years
that.
is a long time. We had a whole COVID during 3 years.
That's right. So a lot can change from paying your 5% deposit on it
Yeah.
to when it actually settles. So there is a lot of risk with that, and I really do think that you're better off, even if buying an apartment is something you want to do or that's within your budget, buy an established one. Buy something that's maybe in a small boutique complex, something that's a little bit older, has nice high ornate ceilings or something like that. That's a little bit of scarcity involved.
Yeah, something's got a unique character about it.
Absolutely. Yeah. Something you can add a bit of value to maybe. But there's definitely better things you can do than buying off the plan, I think. Yep.
All right, Lloyd, so where do you see the Australian property market heading in the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, do you want the good news or the bad news?
Let's start with the good news.
Well, it was all good news.
Yeah.
I think it's going to go up and up and up. No. So I think if you're looking, in the strong markets, the capital city markets, there's always going to be growth. There's always going to be good value in buying in those markets, and also in the strong regional markets that we've spoken about. Probably the slight shift that we've seen since COVID is that some of the regional markets got very, very strong during COVID because people were sort of moving out of the capitals into the regional markets for a bit of a lifestyle change. But then they realised they didn't really like living there and they're moving back to the city, or their boss is calling them back to the office, so they're moving back to the city. So that's something that's changed a bit.
Do you think that's going to affect the coastal markets? Because a lot of people from Sydney sold up, went to the coast thinking, this is great, I have a great lifestyle, and now they're moving back.
Yeah, so to some extent that is affecting some of the coastal market from what I've seen. But I think those markets, because they're so well located, over long term we're still going to get that growth. Probably the sort of growth that we sort of saw in places like Byron Bay isn't going to be quite as bullish as what we've seen in the past, but it'll still be there. Same as sort of South Coast, New South Wales and sunny coast in Queensland. Yeah, the growth will still be there. But I think that the markets are definitely going to keep moving forward. So I think the idea of people sort of sitting on the sidelines thinking like, oh, I see what happens to the market in 6 months or 12 months, which is always a conversation that I have with people. The markets aren't going to just crash, not in well-located areas. So, these strong capital city markets can't keep getting more expensive. But then so are the good regional markets. So I think my advice for people there is that when you can afford to, get into the market. Doesn't matter whether you got 50K deposit or whether you got more. You can work out what your affordability is, what you can afford to spend, and get into the market because time in the market is what's going to count. Sitting on the sidelines is actually going to keep you longer from getting onto the ladder. So I do think that people need to be prepared, for that, and really getting into that market and using those strategies to. And
what about all the talk around population growth compared to building growth? So we've got a huge amount of people coming into the country, and we've got a very low building number at the moment. Is that also going to affect our prices over the next 5 to 10 years?
It will in certain markets, but see, that's such a general topic. There are some areas where there's probably too much building going on and not enough population growth to keep up for it, and that comes back to some areas where there's just a supply of developers building in those particular markets, but where we really need it and where the population is moving to, there's an undersupply. Where there's an undersupply of building and there's people moving to, that's where the strong growth markets are.
And that's where we should be looking then, shouldn't we?
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's where certainly, and like Brisbane is an example of that at the moment, where there's very strong population growth there, and there's definitely a shortage of building going on there. But one of the problems with that right around the country is the red tape and how difficult it is to get the approvals through council. And I think council need to be a little bit more lenient and be able to get those approvals out quicker because there's no way they're going to meet their targets anyway.
No.
What they
they're nowhere near the targets. And I think the way they measure the targets, they're looking at DA approvals, not actually finished product.
That's absolutely right, yeah.
Yeah, and they're at half of what they need to be. So probably advice there is look at those suburbs where there needs to be more growth of property and it's not happening because they're going to be growth suburbs.
They will be, absolutely. But I think, without overthinking it, I think the advice is really just sort of get into it. Yeah, have a go. Just get in there and have a go.
Read the book and have a go.
Yeah, have a go. Yeah.
All right, Lloyd, brings us to that part of our segment. We've got Ed's deal or no deal. So I've got 3 properties for you again today.
Love this one.
I know you're going to have to look through them. I know you haven't seen them yet, so it'll be interesting. I think there's one in here that I quite liked. So are you ready to get into it?
Absolutely.
All right, I'm going to leave that one to last. Right.
Oh.
Right. So the first one I've got is 26 Bradman Street, Charlestown, New South Wales. Price is 1.1 to 1.16. It's a possible duplex site. As you know, I do a little research, seeing out what it can rent for. It looks quite nice on the inside. It can rent for $800 per week. Working out that on the sale price, it's 3.7% return. There's that one there.
That's probably a pretty good deal if you were to develop it. I think it's probably a little bit on the higher price as a general investment property. I don't think there's a lot of meat in it though if you were to develop it, because I know that area quite well. And once you look at building costs in that area, you actually need a double-story duplex or double-story townhouses. So that's going to eat into any profit margin because construction is going to be more expensive. Keeping that as an investment property wouldn't be my advice, because it's actually got a pool, which is one of the things I generally advise against, unless there's a particular reason the client might be happy to have a pool or something like that. That is probably something that I wouldn't necessarily be jumping at this
But
stage.
you would look at Charlestown?
I would look at Charlestown. I've bought in Charlestown before. Good suburb.
Yeah, it's a good suburb. All right, there you go. It's not a deal, but you think it's definitely look around those suburbs and maybe tweak that one a little bit. And
tweak that could potentially work.
All right, next one I've got is 178 Wandale Road, Manly, West Queensland. It's not New South Wales, unfortunately. This one's on 809 square metres of land. They're asking for offers over $775. Rental return would probably be around $500 a week. It's your typical Queenslander, built on stilts. 3% return, I sort of worked out at that one.
Well, that's very interesting. I own a property in this suburb.
Oh, well, do you?
So that's it's an interesting when they say offers over.
Yeah.
So that property is probably going to sell for. So they say offers over 775 in Queensland, particularly in that area. It probably sell for 10 to 15% above the offers over price. So we're probably looking at around about 850 plus.
Yeah.
Potentially higher. Land size is quite good. Can't do a lot with it. It's on stilts, so I'd be a little bit worried about. I'd need to check the flood zoning around there, and I'd be a little bit worried about whether those stilts need a bit of work, because it looks like a bit of a dated house. So that for me, the price point generally is reasonable given what you can get in that area. So Manly West, you can buy 4 or 5 bedroom houses there for sort of 1.2, 1.3, and this is a 3-bedroom house for a little bit cheaper, and just 2Ks down the road at the Esplanade, you can get properties on the Esplanade for 2.5, 3 mil.
Okay.
This are 2Ks back from the Esplanade, and you can get a property for 800K. Even the land value alone means that potentially could be a good investment. I would actually say, yes, let's look at that deeper.
Have a look at it deeper. Because I think maybe they might look at knocking it down, looking at the home that's on there at the moment. Would that be something that someone might do in that area?
The thing I'd need to look at, like you do at a lot of areas, is just the flood zoning. So that area, very good location, but there is a little bit of flood zone you need to be careful of, even in suburbs where some of it's not in a flood zone, some of it is in a flood zone. So that looks a little bit low-lying where that one is. So,
all right, well, it's one to look into. All right, our final one is 1 to 6, 25 Niagara Street, Armandale. This looks like an 80s build. It is 6 2-bedroom units, all built on the ground floor with garages. They're asking $1.450. It's got a gross rental yield of $104,000 a year, which gives you a 7.2% return on your money. It is close to the University of New England. There's that one there. Have a look. Tell me what you think of that one.
Well, I'm familiar with that area. Block of units. My first question would be on that one is there any potential to value add inside? Because if it's already renovated, then that probably misses out a bit of opportunity there. The other question is whether it sits on one title or whether we're able to strata title them, because if we can strata title them, there might be a little bit of equity to be made. The general yield on that doesn't excite me that much. Essentially, if you're buying a block of units there and you're only getting just over 7% yield at that price point, because they're looking for 1.4, been so many units there, the growth is probably going to be a bit less than if you were to buy a house. So while it's very good for yield, you need to weigh that up, and it comes down to your own strategy. Would you spend 1.4 getting a block of units that has good yield on it, or whether you'd be better if you were to invest in that area, buy a house for 400K, which you can get, and then spend another $1 million buying in Manly West in Queensland, and then you have a blue chip asset and a regional asset, and the 400K property in Armado would still have good yield on it. That might be a better strategy than spending all your money
in one spot
on just one spot of units. For me, there's a few things I'd look into closer on it, but I'd probably say I probably wouldn't spend 1.4 on that. Okay. But if I got it for a better price and there was potential to add value, I'd consider it.
All right, so our possible deal today is which one?
So the leading contender today would be the one in Manly West.
There you go. All right, that's not the one I thought that you would have went with.
There you go. And which one are you going to buy?
Oh, look, I did like the one in Armandale. I have some reservations because it is fully renovated. So to do the value add, I don't know where you're going with that. You may look at a subdivision and reselling. Maybe that's the option there, but maybe I'll take your advice and go
Well,
to the Manly
for me,
West?
the value add there would be if they're on in one line, I'd strata title the units and just see what they would be worth individually to sell them.
Mm-hmm.
But you need to also see whether they can be strata titled. So you need to have separate water, separate electricity meters, and 60 fire rating walls between each unit. If they don't have them because it's an older build, that would be expensive to put them in. So that may not be worth it once you do the cost benefit analysis.
Don't do your homework on it.
That's one thing. The other thing too would be a cosmetic reno inside. So there's potential, but we'd need to look further, do more due diligence. On paper, yeah, I'd look at it further.
All right. Thank you, Lloyd.
Thank
you
you.
for today's episode.
Cheers.